Thank you both. That was a very generous introduction, marred by only a few factual inaccuracies, which we won't fatigue our viewers with delineating right now. But I am very grateful to you both for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, I have been wanting to get you on here for over a year, and you had mentioned wait till the second Scalia book came out. And the fact that anyone would say a second Scalia book coming out, I knew had to be a little bit dedicated to that cause. I had read and loved the John Mitchell book, James. As I told you a while back, we were doing a deep dive on Watergate, and I got into John Mitchell and your book very heavily at the time. And we've had Jeff Shepard on the show, Nixon's lawyer. And I understand that in reading the first Scalia book, there was some interaction between Scalia and Jeff Shepard at some point during Watergate. I don't know if you remember that in the book.
Absolutely, yeah. And Jeff makes several cameos in the new book, Volume 2.
Oh, great. That's what I was going to ask. That's what I was going to ask you. So I want to have him back on. So that's my bait to bring him back on is your second book, James.
Well, whatever works.
Okay, so why two books on Scalia? I mean, is Scalia that huge? I mean, how big is Scalia that your wife is probably going crazy that you've written two books on one guy, or that you're dedicating so much life of your life to writing books anyway?
You're more accurate than you can know because this is the second of what will be 3 volumes on Antonin Scalia.
Oh,
Yes, this
no.
is a 3-volume project now.
Wow.
The new book just came out last month. It's called Scalia, Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2001. And it covers the first half of Antonin Scalia's hugely influential, momentous, nearly 30 terms on the Supreme Court. It takes you from his first day on the job as a new justice, walking into the Supreme Court in 1986, up through the national trauma of Bush v. Gore in 2000, and the aftermath of that case the following year. And as we mentioned, it's the second installment in a 3-volume project. So the first book was called Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986. And that covered the first 50 years of his life and ended with him sitting down in his chair on the Supreme Court. That book came out about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And so there's still volume 3 to come, which will take us through the second half of Justice Scalia's tenure on the Supreme Court and his death and his legacy. But the most important point I want to get across to our listeners and our viewers right now is these books are not just for lawyers. These books are for everyone. I'm not a lawyer. I wrote them. And just in preparing this second volume for hardcovers and the editing process, I found myself cracking up every sitting because Scalia himself was such a funny and witty guy. There's one chapter in this new book called The Rabbit, which details my own 2 one-on-one lunches that I had with Justice Scalia.
Wow.
30 and 32 years old, way back in 1999 and 2001. And what's it like to have lunch with Antonin Scalia, where, you're pouring wine for each other. He's making me eat vegetables off of his plate. I said, Mr. Justice, I couldn't. He says, come on. So now, like in a sitcom, I'm suddenly awakened and here's me shoveling Justice Scalia's vegetables off of his plate into my mouth. And the reason it's called The Rabbit is because I ordered veal parmesan and he just said, no, give him the rabbit. You're going to like the rabbit. Give him the rabbit. And I didn't want rabbit and I never had rabbit. Well, I was grossed out by rabbit and I haven't had rabbit since. But here, what's significant about it is that you have the country's foremost opponent of judicial activism overruling my lunch order, which not even Mrs. Rosen does. So you'll get the law from these books. You'll get how Antonin Scalia, you asked, is he really worth 3 volumes? Absolutely, Mark.
Wow.
Antonin Scalia is not just one of the most important Supreme Court justices of recent memory. Antonin Scalia is one of the most important Americans of the last 100 years. He changed the way the law is drafted, enacted, argued, and decided in this country. That touches every facet of American life and in turn, every American alive today. But you'll also get the man, what he was like with Mrs. Scalia, with his kids, with the other justices where the relationships were sometimes contentious.
Tell the audience how many kids he happened to have had.
The Scalias had 9 children. They are all devout Catholics today, as of course Nino and Maureen Scalia were and remain. Maureen Scalia is a living saint. She raised those 9 kids largely without any assistance from Justice Scalia, as both of them would tell you, and as both of them did tell me. And one of the 9 children, of course, is Father Paul Scalia, who is the vicar of clergy at the Arlington, Virginia Archdiocese. So he's the only one that didn't start a family, but the other 8 did, and they all have kids multiple kids, ranging from a minimum of 4 to a maximum of 7.
So he had a Supreme Court at home.
Wow.
Yes, he had the boys exercised a 5-4 majority.
Wow.
The girls.
Well, for a baseball team, if you want to go that into.
His aunt used to say he always wanted a baseball team. But this book will acquaint you profoundly with Scalia the Catholic. The first book traced the formation of Antonin Scalia's faith. He was a product of Jesuit schools, and he was a valedictorian at 2 Jesuit institutions in a row, including Georgetown University. This book traces his struggles to keep separate the tenets of his Catholic faith and his opinions as a justice, because his philosophy that he brought to judging, which I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss in some depth, it's why he's one of the most important Americans of the last 100 years. But he did not want latter-day judges and justices grafting their own latter-day policy preferences onto the meaning of enduring texts such as the Constitution or any law that's been enacted since. Likewise, he did not want to graft his own Catholic tenets onto his jurisprudence. And the way he would put it is he would say there's no such thing as a Catholic hamburger. He'd say the closest we could come would be a hamburger that is made perfect.
That's funny. That's funny.
You talked about relationships. You just brought that briefly. He very famously had a relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or recall. Were they in fact best friends? It was kind of represented as such that they were really, really very close.
They were very close friends, and their families would celebrate New Year's together every year. And Marty Ginsburg and Maureen Scalia would do the cooking. The first book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, traces the birth and the blossoming of this famous friendship in real time, in their own words, because I was the first researcher to go through Ruth Bader Ginsburg's papers at the Library of Congress for the period when she served as an appellate judge on the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. That's one rung below the Supreme Court, and it's often described as the second most powerful court in America for 2 reasons. One, because its docket so heavily shapes the work of the Supreme Court, and also because so many of the justices on the Supreme Court are plucked from the ranks of the D.C. Circuit. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg preceded Scalia there. She had been appointed by President Carter. President Reagan in 1982 appoints Scalia to the D.C. Circuit. And what a murderer's row of judicial talent is on that bench at that time. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Antonin Scalia, Robert Bork, Kenneth Starr, Lawrence Silberman, James L. Buckley, truly a 27 Yankees of judicial talent. And in the memos and the doodles and the handwritten notes and the draft opinions that were flying back and forth from between the chambers of Judge Ginsburg and Judge Scalia in those years from 1982 to 1986, at which point Scalia is elevated to the Supreme Court, and she follows him maybe 7 years later. That's where you can really see this friendship take hold as they're kibitzing each other, felling over each other, needling each other, at times conspiring against one another, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg writing to Bob Bork, here's what we have to do to address Nino's challenge. So you could see that friendship take off. In this new book, Scalia's Supreme Court years, 1986 to 2001, that friendship continues, of course, but we also see the justice's other relationships with his robed colleagues. Perhaps the friend or the justice with whom he had the deepest bond was not necessarily RBG, but Clarence Thomas. And this book recounts the extraordinary ordeal that Clarence Thomas endured in order to make it to the court, and the hand outstretched that he found waiting for him when he got there was a man he had never met before, Antonin Scalia. And I interviewed Justice Thomas for this project in chambers for about 2.5 hours. And he told me how early on they became brothers for life, sneaking off to go smoke cigarettes in the lawyer's lounge together, breaking loose from their marshal's detail to go attend a Catholic mass, an afternoon mass near the court together, and how Scalia took risks to side with Thomas on certain cases, and Thomas never forgot that. But we also see Scalia's relationship, for example, with Sandra Day O'Connor, which I have a photograph in this new book, Scalia's Supreme Court Years, that's never been published before. It was taken on Halloween night, 1986, in one of those dark wood-paneled rooms at the Supreme Court. And it shows Antonin Scalia, Justice Scalia, standing next to Justice O'Connor. They're both dressed professionally. He's got a suit and tie on. She has a jacket and a blouse and a skirt on. But he is wearing a red bulbous clown nose, and she is wearing one of those monstrous Groucho eyes with eyebrow nose and mustache glasses. And they're both got great big smiles on their faces. And as I wrote in the caption to that photograph, their relationship only went downhill from there. A casualty of the sharp differences that they had between them in how a judge properly goes about his or her business. That is to say, differences over their clashing methods of constitutional and statutory interpretation, but also a casualty of Scalia's willingness to call out Sandra Day O'Connor when he thought that the writing and the thinking in her opinions was muddled, and he didn't shy from it. And in one case in 1989, he said that her writings on the particular subject at hand, which was abortion, quote, cannot be taken seriously. And my book has a number of previously unpublished anecdotes that show just how great was the rupture between them after that.
Can you just bring us into the rupture between him and Bork? Because I thought that they were famous friends also. And something, I don't remember what broke them up, James.
Yes. This is another subject that's treated in some depth in the first volume, Scalia Rise to Greatness.
Yeah.
Bob Bork, starting in the early 1970s, really was the first intellectual on the right to challenge the perceived excesses of the Warren Court, and basically to accuse the Warren Court of establishing constitutional rights here, there, and everywhere that really weren't rooted in the Constitution or in historical consensus or practice in this country. And he wrote an article in 1971 for the Indiana Law Review, and it became an instant classic, and it made Bob Bork a kind of a god of sorts in this burgeoning, nascent, conservative legal counter-revolution to the Warren Court. And for the entire time they knew each other up until 1986, Bork was sort of the senior partner. Bork was much more well-known than Antonin Scalia, and he gives his buddy Antonin Scalia a leg up at various junctures in Scalia's career. And so deep was the bond between these men that at one point Scalia, after a party at the Scalia's home, whips around and says to his eldest son, Gene Scalia, obviously a prominent attorney in his own right and a former cabinet official, and he says to him, Gene, this is why you work hard and you study hard in school, so you can grow up to have friends like Bob Bork. And yet, come the point where the two men are now seated alongside each other on the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, Bork issues a ruling in a libel case that involved the famous columnists Evans and Novak.
Oh, right.
In which Bork said things that just struck Scalia and all other originalists as heretical. Here was Bork in 1984 saying that we shouldn't apply existing statutes and the text of existing statutes in a wooden, rigid, mechanical manner. That there has to be some room for evolution in our understanding of what the First Amendment means and so forth. Scalia wrote a concurrence in that case just for the purpose of rebuking Bork on those grounds. And Bork never got over it. And in fact, 5 years later, in 1989, by which point Scalia's on the court and Bork has been nominated and defeated at the U.S. Senate for the court, Bork publishes his famous bestseller, The Tempting of America, and he's got 5 pages in there dedicated to rebutting that concurrence from Scalia without mentioning Scalia by name, but saying in a way that everyone who read that book understood to mean Scalia, that anyone who would argue against what Judge Bork had said in that opinion, the way Scalia was, had no business being a judge or, for that matter, a law professor. And then in this book, Scalia's Supreme Court years, we tell the story of the Bork hearings and the sort of frosty relationship between the Borks and the Scalias by that point. And so it was a relationship that didn't survive their enmeshment in the law, in their rival ambitions. One thing I can tell you that has been told to me is that, and this will be covered in Volume 3 when Robert Bork passes away, Scalia wept at Bob Bork's funeral.
Wow.
Could you discuss Scalia's originalist philosophy? You said you wanted to definitely talk about the philosophy, and I think that's a big great point.
Thank you, Eric. Yes. So when Scalia became a federal judge in the mid-1980s, there prevailed in American law at that time a liberal notion called the living Constitution. This is the idea that the meaning of the Constitution, with its various provisions, and clauses should expand like a living, breathing organism in order to account for phenomena that the founders could never have anticipated, such as the internet or nuclear weapons or social media or what have you. And in order to breathe this expanded meaning into these texts of the Constitution or different statutes enacted at any point since, the living constitutionalist judge, which was practically all judges by the mid-1980s, would tend to relegate the text of the law itself to a secondary position. They wanted to know what not the law said or meant in its own time, but what should it mean for today? Well, what did the founders or the lawmakers who enacted a statute, what was their intent? What was the what was the lawmakers' intent? And to get to the lawmakers' intent, these living constitutionalist judges, again, bypassing the text of the law, would plunge themselves into the legislative history of that law. What was said in all those House and Senate floor speeches? What was said in all those committee reports generated before the lawmakers voted? Scalia stood athwart all of that. Scalia's view was that the Constitution is neither living nor dead, but rather it is a binding, enduring legal text, just as all laws are, and that judges and justices, when they're engaged in their central business, and what is the central business of a judge? It is to interpret the law and tell us what it means. Scalia's view was that we should not expand the meaning like a living, breathing organism, but rather we should adhere to the meaning that the Constitution or any given law possessed when it was enacted, at the time of its enactment, the meaning it was widely understood to have. And how do you discern the original meaning of a law? Scalia had a tool for that called textualism. I say that textualism was his metal detector to discern the original meaning of a law. Start first and foremost with what did the law say? Scalia used to say, I don't care if we would discover a scrap of paper somewhere that was signed by all the founders that would declare their secret intention for what they meant to say in the Constitution. Scalia's view was, you know what the legislative intent is in a law? The text, what you voted up or down on, and what a president signed into law. So this was a radical notion when he came along. But through the force of his personality, through his genius, through his dazzling literary skills, not because he was so often on the winning side of cases, but more frequently in dissent, and through his tireless evangelism on and off the court on behalf of these concepts of originalism and textualism, Scalia, by the time he died, had ushered in, almost single-handedly, a kind of counter-revolution in the law, where now, when the law is drafted, argued, and decided, very little reference is made to legislative history or the ephemera of the legislative process. The text is the place where lawyers arguing before the courts start now. And as I say, this changed the way the law is drafted, enacted, and decided in this country for every American. No less a figure than Justice Elena Kagan, who was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Obama, pronounced that, in effect, as a result of this counter-revolution led by Antonin Scalia, she said publicly, quote, "We're all originalists now."
Wow.
Speaking of Kagan, and this I think is on point, Scalia is very famous for his dissent on, I believe it's Morrison versus Olson.
Mhm.
And there was a dissent today with Jackson, and it was a 8-1 victory. Now, do you feel like this is a legitimate dissent that's going to change things in history like Scalia has had an effect, or is this more of a whiny eighth wheel or ninth wheel?
I don't feel equipped to say, honestly. One of the functions of writing these books is that I've become an expert on the Rehnquist court, and soon I'll be an expert on the first portion of the Roberts court when I get to volume 3. But I can't say that I'm an expert on the dynamics of the justices today. This was an 8-1 opinion, and that's rare in the current configuration of the Supreme Court, where conservatives enjoy a 6-3 sort of supermajority. Seldom do you see the 2 of the 3 so-called living constitutionalist justices on the bench now agreeing with that conservative majority. So it doesn't bode well, let's say, for Justice Jackson's opinion to someday become the law.
James, let me ask something. Going back in time again, which I'm fascinated about this period of time during Nixon, the OTP, the Office of Telecommunications Policy, I don't think it exists anymore. Was Scalia the general counsel for OTP when he was making these rulings about the future of the internet, the future of satellite communications, the future of HBO? the future of meeting with Jack Valente. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how he saw this coming, James.
Mark is establishing, Eric, so far a perfect batting record for kindly asking me to delineate things that appeared in the first volume and not the new book, but okay.
That's just my own curiosity.
Yes.
I love that book.
Thank you. And this was covered in the first volume, Scalia Rise to Greatness. His first job in the government, when he was 35 years old, he was appointed to be the general counsel to a new agency that was created by the Nixon administration in 1970. It was called the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy, or OTP. And it was the brainchild of an honest-to-God visionary and genius who was younger than Scalia, named Clay Whitehead, otherwise known as Tom Whitehead. And Tom had multiple degrees from MIT and elsewhere. When he volunteered for combat duty in Vietnam, they put him to work instead behind the scenes, developing chemical and biological weapons defenses. He was an honest-to-God visionary and a genius, and he had served on the Nixon campaign as a young man. And he told White House Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, look, right now, telecom policy is spread out across a bunch of different agencies, and it's an incoherent jumble. And telecommunications is the future of human civilization and the United States economy. And you really ought to centralize the policymaking surrounding telecommunications in the executive office of the president. Haldeman and Nixon agreed, and they said, we'd like you to run it, Tom, which Whitehead really didn't want to do, but he did. And his first decision, when he needed a good lawyer, he hired Antonin Scalia. And I was the first researcher to go through the papers of OTP and see the correspondence between Whitehead and Scalia. And it's really fascinating. This whole team of people, and by the way, their press officer was Brian Lamb, who later started C-SPAN.
Right.
And this is someone who was therefore one of Scalia's dearest friends for 45 years or so. These guys were exchanging memos and routing slips in the early 70s, featuring terms that would not escape the lips of ordinary Americans for the next 25 years, such as mobile networks and shared communications platforms. They were throwing these terms around. Scalia in 1971 wrote a paper, I was the first to publish its contents, called The Computer Society, in which he didn't use the term internet, but he absolutely predicted the internet. He talked about users at remote terminals who would have access to hundreds of TV channels, who would do their banking from these terminals, who would be able to print out news reports from these channels and so forth. He also talked about the attendant privacy concerns. So Scalia got the technology. And in fact, as a justice on the Supreme Court many years later, when there would be telecom cases, he took a particular relish in writing on those cases. But yes, the great innovation of OTP in that period was a policy called open skies. Over the objections from the interagency partners such as the FCC, the State Department, and others, Scalia and Whitehead were able to ram through this open skies policy. At the time, in the early 70s, there was only one entity that was allowed to launch domestic space satellites into space. It was a quasi-public, quasi-private international consortium called, I think, ComSat. And Scalia needed a legal opinion from the Department of Justice in order to say that it was lawful for the Nixon administration to pursue a policy under which open skies, any American firm that had the requisite capital reserves and technical prowess could launch a domestic space satellite into space. In short, what they wanted to do was apply the free market competitive principles to the launching of domestic space satellites. And in early October 1971, that opinion comes back to Scalia's desk from the Department of Justice. We know exactly when he got it because there's a stamp and markings on it as to when it was delivered into his hands. And the person who wrote the binding legal memo gave Scalia the answer he needed, that yes, this was lawful, and in fact flipped the question neatly on its head and said, we see no evidence that ComSat was ever intended to enjoy a monopoly on the launching of domestic space satellites into space. The individual who wrote this opinion for Scalia first fetched a little bit about not receiving enough time to work on it, only 2 weeks, which would be laughable from today's sense of how time moves. And it also quoted from legislative history, which probably didn't strike Scalia quite well. But nonetheless, it was the opinion Scalia needed. This opinion was written by the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice at the time. And it reached Scalia's hands 6 days before this person was nominated to the Supreme Court. This person was William Rehnquist. And so this document had never appeared before. It's the earliest known correspondence between them. And as I said, it was the first time and the only time that Antonin Scalia tasked William Rehnquist with authoring an opinion. And it changed the policy. And that policy of open skies turbocharged the digital revolution that we have seen ever since.
Wow. Does he replace Rehnquist at as deputy AG?
No. So a fellow named Roger Crampton became Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel. He
Okay.
calls up Scalia and says, "You should take the job I just vacated,"
Right.
which was to serve, which he did, which was to serve as chairman of something called the Administrative Conference of the United States. Doesn't exist anymore. AUS was a kind of a government think tank for the regulatory state. And then 2 years in that job, Crampton then leaves, I think, to teach law. And then Scalia does succeed Crampton as the successor to Rehnquist in that job, Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel. The entwinements between Scalia and Rehnquist are very frequent at critical juncture points in their career. And that's something that's set out both in Volume 1 and again here in Volume 2.
I appreciate you using Yiddish phrases, and maybe you can address, because it's Passover coming up, James, but maybe you can address this odd thing about him fasting at one point. Was it with
Yes.
Silberman and he goes to shul with him? Or vaguely remember that. Sorry
Yeah,
about the
this is
first
also
book, but I
from-
haven't read the second one yet.
This is from Volume 1. I can assure you that there are nouns, verbs, and vowels in both books, Mark.
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
And they are not. If your mother says she loves you, check it out.
Yeah.
Yes. In the first volume, Scalia's a colleague, his deputy, at OTP, the Office of Telecommunications Policy, was a man named Henry Goldberg, still with us.
Oh, Henry
And he
Goldberg,
told me the
right.
story of how Scalia was saying to him at one point, Catholics don't know how to fast properly. The Jews, they know how to fast. And Yom Kippur was upon them. And he said, well, let's put your money where your mouth is. You want to fast? And he did. But he showed up for shul at Goldberg's house, having played racquetball for 2 hours. And so he was completely dehydrated and he was a wreck. And Goldberg didn't know if Scalia was going to make it through those services, but he did.
Thank
See,
you.
it's actually a strategy. Mark is focusing on the first book. You're on the second, so you have to come back and talk.
You have to come back for the third. Yeah.
And then
Hopefully not to talk about the second one. And then when I have a book out after that, despite Mrs. Rosen's wishes, we can only talk Scalia. That makes
Right.
it
Thank you.
to James.
Thank you for coming on today, and thank you for the second book, which I can't wait to read. We have links in the description for both books. Also, the John Mitchell book that I really love. If anybody's ever allowed to talk about that book, that'll be another show. But definitely pick up the first 2 books on Scalia, as James described, an American hero, and really unheralded in a lot of circles because, as you described, the attitudes of his other biographers seem to be incredibly antagonistic towards him for reasons that make absolutely no sense.
This is the most comprehensive portrait of Scalia's life. It's the first undertaken since he passed away 10 years ago. So I've had access to a lot of documents that the previous biographers did not, including an oral history he gave in chambers in 1992 of his own life.
Right.
And the first 2 books both came out while he was alive. One he cooperated with, the other not at all. And both came out in the same place, which was very hostile. So I like to say that this is the first biography of Antonin Scalia where the author has his head screwed on straight.
Yeah, and it's definitely worth reading for everybody, including your kids at home, and a great gift. Get both volumes as soon as you can. The links are in the description. James, thank you. I know you're busy. Your wife is waiting for you to get back to your life. And thank you for coming on today. I really
Thank you
appreciate it.
both. You're very kind. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.